Alright. So we need to talk about how do we introduce and stuff again?
Yeah, we're gonna do names. I'm Felix, I'm Matthew.
Hello, welcome to Talking in the Chasm.
I'm Felix, I'm Matthew. Today we're gonna talk about...
Alright. So we say hello, welcome to Talking in the Chasm. Compassionate, controversial conversation between best friends. Holy man.
An atheist.
Atheist. I'm Felix.
And I'm Matthew.
Sweet. So what are we talking about today?
Today we want to look at the ugly stuff.
Gonna dive right in.
Dive right in. We want to talk about abortion.
Nice. Alright.
And we don't have any notes, so
Nope, just off the cuff.
we're just gonna make it up as we go.
I'm a pro-choice kind of guy.
And I'm pro-life.
Yeah. I'm anti-life, you know. Screw life. What's that about?
Well, when I was young, it was very common to call the position anti-abortion, and somewhere along the way, the PR team got a hold of it and said
Yeah,
that was
they
not,
sure did.
that didn't sell well.
Because pro-life is tough to...
Tough to argue.
Yeah, I mean, who's not pro-life?
So how should we start? Why?
Well, let's start with how we feel.
Okay.
All right. You've actually just from knowing you and talking to you, you've based quite a lot of your life's decisions on whether or not it has affected abortion, as far as like whether research was done on fetuses and stuff like that. If you find that medication has been discovered because of its
Oh yeah.
use of fetuses and stuff, and that
Vaccines.
factors into your...
Yeah, there's vaccines and other medicines that use aborted fetal cell lines, and I'm not just to be clear. It's not that I think that there's aborted tissue actually in those things, but they're derived from cell lines that came from abortions. So yeah, that does factor into the morality for us of using certain vaccines in particular, and would apply to medicines as well. I think
I mean, it's straight up, for you, abortion is murder. It is murdering a human being.
yeah. And I think that's one of the things that actually puts some civility into the discourse, whether or not you accept that premise. It has to be clear that anyone who would accept that premise has to feel strongly about it. Like,
Well,
if someone
sure.
believes it's killing a baby,
Right.
then you have to feel strongly about it. And you would have to do anything you could to try to stop it. I mean,
Right.
within whatever personal limits you ascribe to that
Right.
kind
I mean,
of moral.
I'm anti-capital punishment,
Uh-huh.
big time. Like, I think that's absolutely horrible. But I'm not going to break into a prison where they do that and try to cut the wires and stop it from happening, and using everything that you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
I'll vote against it or whatever.
Sure.
And I will tell people that I disagree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
But, as far as my actively doing something physically outside in the world to change people's opinions, that's where it gets a little dicey, with the
Yeah.
abortion clinics and
And I've done that.
bombing clinics.
Oh, I haven't done that.
Yeah.
I have protested outside of abortion clinics, and I've certainly been part of public demonstrations in advocating against abortion. I think, and it comes from that conviction that these are babies that we're talking about, and that really supersedes everything else in the argument, that we're talking about ending the lives of children.
Right.
So what I guess that's obviously the bottom line of the debate. So So if someone's like me says to you, well, it's killing a child and that's indefensible for any other reasons, what do you say to that?
Well, to that I say, you know, and this is the big question, right? Where does life begin, right? Does it begin at conception? Does it begin once the child is born? Does it begin once the child is breathing? Does it begin when the heart beats? I mean, and this is more of a philosophical question. This isn't a scientific, here's where it is and here's where it isn't. I mean, so for me, I don't think of a fetus as alive, really, until it's outside and has its own entity.
What about pain?
That's one thing. But the other thing, sorry? Pain?
What about feeling pain?
Um,
A nervous system that would react to pain.
yeah, I mean...
Like there's a heartbeat at 3 weeks, sucking thumbs at
Right.
9 weeks.
No, I get that. And my thing is I don't really have a problem with death. I mean, we kill cows and chickens and they have feelings and heartbeats and, I mean, when I look at it as as people who decide to get an abortion, and I've never really been in this situation, so I mean, it's very difficult for me to put myself in the shoes of somebody who feels like they have no way out. But for somebody who feels like they are not able to handle a child, they're probably right. And so many people have children who shouldn't have children, and that's part of what makes the world miserable.
Yeah.
Is these children who are mistreated and abused and in horrible situations, or even in just really bad situations. I mean, some of them manage to pull through, some of them don't. So for me, it's more of a quality of life thing. It's like, is this child going to have a life worth living? Is the mother going to be able to raise this child? If not, do we force her to do that? Or do we force her to have a child and then give it up and then wonder for the rest of her life what's up with this? Where's this child? What's going on? I mean, I wish that you could have a test before you become a parent. Here's here's an empathy test, and here's communications test, and all the things that you would have to do to really be an effective parent. Then we really wouldn't have very many problems in this world. So my big concern is the quality of life for that child.
So let me ask some questions about that. I know lots of people who have endured abuse in hard situations, and most of them don't want to be dead. How does that square with that rationale? And secondly, what makes an unborn child unique in that regard? Like, does it make sense then to kill people who are poor or who are homeless or who endure trauma? Or
Well, I mean, part of the human condition is that we try to survive. I mean, there's very few people in the world who would rather be dead at the moment.
Doesn't that speak to the value of life?
Well, I mean, you could say sure that the goal is to just keep the heart beating at any cost for as long as we possibly can. Is that the goal? If a woman has decided that she does not want to have a child and becomes pregnant and is just can't do it, is unable to, before that child is born, if she makes that decision not to go through and raise a child that she doesn't want or is unable to, then I think that, should be her right. It's almost like saying, we don't have the right to end a life because it's inconvenient for us. Okay? So for instance, a pro-life kind of stance would be, well, because it's convenient for the mother, is murder okay? Because she would have a hard time raising the child, so it's okay that we murder something. And there's a philosophical argument that says let's say that somebody knocks you out and you wake up and you're chained to a person who needed a kidney or something, and you've got a tube that's going out of you into that person, and you are keeping that person alive, chained to him. Do you owe it to life to spend the rest of your life chained to this person to make sure that he's alive? I mean, because if you were to say, I didn't ask for this, I don't want to be here, I'm going to force myself out of this situation, and that guy's going to die. I mean, you know, what's the answer to that?
Well, there's a few problems with the analogy. In almost all cases, we choose whether or not there's a child. Not every case, but in almost all cases, we're directly responsible for that child's coming to be. So there's a shared responsibility there. And secondly, it's not a lifelong thing. And thirdly, there's other options. The question is whether or not abortion, taking that life and causing it to cease, is better than the other alternatives, like abortion or like being inconvenienced or like, because it's a moral equivalency. What's worse, to endure 9 months with that child or to cause that life to cease? I think when I analyze that moral conundrum, life is more valuable than inconvenience. In the proposition you're talking about, I don't know how to evaluate that. It's a whole different set of circumstances.
Right, but philosophically it's the same thing. Is your convenience more important than killing someone? And maybe that example is totally extreme, but that's what philosophy is about. It's like, let's push it all the way to the very end, and how far does it go? You know, because you can't say it's okay here but not okay there if it's a
Well, you can't if they're
code
not.
with which you live.
You can't say you can't say it if they're morally equivalent, and I don't know that the two are equivalent. I think what is hard for me in the case of trying to make sense of the pro-choice argument is that I understand my own prejudices. I understand my own, at least I try to, my own convictions about the preciousness of life coming from God. But the thing that really disturbs me about the idea of abortion is that it's tantamount to a lot of other really ugly things that we've done as people. When we decide that a certain set of our species is not really people, that leads to really horrible things. In Dred Scott, when an African enslaved person is 3/5 of a person for census taking or declared by the court as not a human, that's really, really bad stuff.
Right.
When the Jews defend the slaughter of, when the Nazis defend the slaughter of the Jews as they're not humans, they're rats. And we do the same thing with the unborn when we say that they're not really humans worthy of life. And that's the philosophical conundrum that bothers me the most, more than convenience, more than the attachment between mother and child.
I mean, I think the main question is, what is life? That's the main question. Because you have sex with prophylactics, is that okay? Because life hasn't happened yet? I mean, is life the joining of the sperm and the egg? Is that what life is? Because, in vitro fertilization, they fertilize lots and lots and lots of eggs, knowing that they're going to throw away 90% of them because they're not all going to take or whatever. Actual fertilized eggs, like living things, are going to because that's the only way that we've been able to figure it out. What's your thought on that? I mean, somebody really wants a baby, they want their own natural baby, and so they fertilize 50 eggs and they get one baby out of it, and they get 49 fertilized eggs that get thrown away.
Yeah, I don't like the idea. I mean, I don't know how. I don't know what the minimum bar for life is, but there seems like there's certainly some indices after the minimum that are pretty clear, like brain activity, like a beating heart, like
What is it for you?
well,
Like, where's that line? Where,
because I don't,
alive and not alive.
because I can't discern it, I just put it at conception. If there's conception, if if there's a joining between an egg and a sperm, that's life, and
so then the destruction of fertilized eggs
would be a problem. Yeah,
is a problem. So
Yeah.
in vitro fertilization for you is a big problem.
yeah,
You just don't have kids.
yeah, or adopt.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I think it's worth for me to describe why, from religious reasons, from philosophical and religious reasons, why life is worth the consideration that it is. And these things are all completely subjective to my own perspective. I don't know that they'll resonate with somebody that doesn't have my biases, but from my perspective, there's a very interesting story, and it doesn't get discussed in this conversation very much, but there's a very interesting story about Jesus. He had some really good friends in Bethany, and their names were Mary and Martha and Lazarus. They were brothers and sisters, and they were very close friends of his. And one time, somebody came to Jesus, and he was with all of his guys, and they said, "Your friend Lazarus is sick." And he says, "Okay." And they start headed to Bethany. Well, there was two ways to go. There was a short way and a quick way. They took the long way, and halfway there, Jesus tells his disciples, "Lazarus sleeps," as a euphemism for his dead. And they didn't get it. They said, "Well, if he sleeps, that's good. Like, that's what you need to do when you're sick." And he says, "No, Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes, that the glory of God would be revealed." Okay, so he knows before he even gets there, something's going to happen. So then he gets there, and when he's on the edge of the town, Martha hears, I don't remember if it was Mary or Martha, one of the sisters hears, and she runs to him at the city gates, and she starts crying. Because they believed in Jesus as the healer, as the miracle maker. And she says, "I know if you would have been here, Lazarus would be alive." And he says to her, "Do you believe that you'll see your brother?" And she says, "Yes, Lord, in the resurrection." And he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." And then he goes and he sees the other sister, and they say, "Take me to the tomb." And the shortest verse in the Bible is the next verse. It says, "Jesus wept." And why does he cry? He knows that what's going to happen. He's already prophesied it in the past, and what's about to happen is he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. But he stands outside of a tomb and he weeps. It says that he groaned in his spirit. Like, it's not just like shed a tear. He was distraught. Mm-hmm. And the point to the story for me is that, along with a bunch of other things, he does go and he says, "Lazarus, come forth," and Lazarus comes out of the tomb and he's alive from the dead. It's incredible. But the point to the story for me is this, that Jesus in his whole ministry has one enemy, and it's death. Because death is not a part of the original creation. Death comes through sin. When Adam and Eve choose to rebel against God, that's when death comes into the world. And Jesus' whole gig, his whole point for being, is to unseat death. That's the enemy. And that creates for me a holistic view that's always in favor of life, that always prefers life to the alternative. Whether it's abortion or capital punishment or euthanasia, life is always preferable because death is the enemy. And so that's like a status quo position for me. And I think for conscientious Christians that are trying to be holistic about the way they think about all of these issues. So that's not a political position, right? It's not like
Right.
it's not something that you can undo. It's not. The root of that comes back to where life originates, where life comes from, and death as its opposition, and always being against the opposite.
Right. Well, so there was no death until there was sin. And it's interesting because scientifically, you can say that there's no death unless there's sex, right? Because asexual reproduction is just a creature that just divides and divides and divides.
Mm-hmm.
It never dies. It's just, that's how it goes. It's not until we have sexual reproduction that we have death, and using the continuation of the genes, and death is what makes that possible, right? That makes genetics and evolution possible, is this death. And what we did is we traded sex for death,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's just interesting how there's that sort of correlation. How you could say, well, sin,
Mm-hmm.
sex as sin. There wasn't death until that happened, but there is death now, and death is here. And this is part of what I don't understand about religion and God. Is did not God make death? Death is part of this world, and He made the world and
Mm-hmm.
everything in it, and so. For everything to be in opposition of death just seems a little crazy, since that's part of the plan. I mean, it's part of what happens in life.
It's part of what we experience. I would say that it wasn't a part of the plan, and it won't be a part of the plan in the future. That
So
the
you
resurrection.
believe that there's like a spirit that keeps on,
Yeah.
after death. You will keep on after death.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, why did you then start, 40-something years ago? How old are you?
41.
41. So 41 years ago is when you started?
Yeah.
And now you're here forever. That's
Yeah.
forever and ever. Well, why wouldn't you have just kind of always been there forever? I mean, just philosophically, the word forever is never ending, but it can never begin either, because forever is.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Uh,
Getting off topic.
Yeah, a little bit off
topic.
but
that's what
things
we do.
Can begin and then not end. That to not end is not to imply never having begun. I don't think that's I don't think those things are the same statement.
Well, I think, and we'll talk about this later, but similar to, you cannot have nothing and something, because nothing implies that there is nothing. So if you have something, then you can't have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It's one or the other, and that's sort of how forever is. It's to have a beginning is to have a finite. Here's the beginning, and then we go on. Well, forever would mean we go on in all directions. That's what forever is. So there can't really be a beginning if you talk about forever as having no end and being infinite. You know what I mean? So
I don't know that I agree with the premise, but there's other possible resolutions. Maybe what's in me that's eternal comes from God. Maybe that's the breath of God in every life. Maybe that's what happens at conception, and maybe that's a piece of Him that is from forever. That would be a resolution to the same dilemma.
Well, let me ask you this. Now, when we talk about death, you are okay with animals dying.
Mm-hmm.
But God breathed life into that cow, and that cow is alive and feels pain, and in many cases, we don't understand most of animal life, but we certainly, we're always like, oh my gosh, chimpanzees mourn their dead, and they, elephants cry, and they have funerals, and
Dogs sit on graves.
At what point is it not okay to kill?
Well, similarly, there wasn't death in the animal world as part of the original creation either, and there won't be in the future. Like in the second advent when Jesus returns, there's not death anymore there either. And in fact, the prophecies talk about the pacification of the animal world, that the wolf will lay down with the lamb, that the animosity between the animal kingdom even is ceased under the peace of Jesus' return. So at least in imagery context, that's a past and a future resolution. We're in a parenthetical phase after the fall. The original creation doesn't have that animosity even in the animal world, and the future epoch, the eschaton is what we call it, doesn't have that animosity either. There is something qualitatively different, though, in human life, all the way back to the beginning from a Christian worldview. Man has, in the creation narrative, man has the breath of God himself. So the animals are formed, or created, but the distinction between the animal kingdom and man is that man has that eternal capacity, that breath of God in him. That's how he becomes animate, is through the direct application of God's pneuma, it's the same word for spirit, into the proto-man Adam. And so the differences that we see between man and the animal kingdom, whether it's our capacity for language or emotion, and I know that animals have a lower form of language and emotion, but those distinctions that we see between man and the animal kingdom, which I'm guessing from your worldview are a lot more blurry.
Right. I mean,
There's no
certainly
distinction.
a mosquito is very different than an orangutan.
Mm-hmm.
And, as the brain just gets more and more sophisticated, at some point you're going to say, okay, well, from this point of sophistication onward, we don't kill. It's morally unacceptable to kill. And then from this point of sophistication below, we can't. I've never really asked you this, but do you believe in an evolution? Like, do you believe that there was a change in the shape of the skeleton of man, and that we,
Yeah.
the Cro-Magnon and all that stuff, and how we, we're...
I don't believe in an evolution of species. I believe that the species were created by God distinct. So birds were birds, fish were
Right.
fish,
and
horses were horses.
And how do you sort of square with, the fossil evidence of there being in between?
Well, I
things?
don't. I haven't invested much. My main pause in regards to that theory is that, and I just don't know. I don't know how. I don't know much about it at all, and I'm ignorant about a whole lot of things, and that's one of them. But my real main objection to evolution are two spiritual laws. One is the law of sowing and reaping. There's a Bible verse that says, and I know this is a silly thing to pull out as an argument, but that which a man sows, also what shall he reap. And this idea of sowing and reaping, that seed bears fruit after its own kind, that a grape is always a grape, an orange is always an orange, that there's this distinction of species, is a part of the world as I know it. And that matches my very tiny perspective of the world, because it's the way everything is. So stretching back into the past, where I don't have access, where I don't have first-hand information, I don't know what the fossil record implies. I don't know where it is. I've not studied anthropology, or not anthropology, it's study man. Whatever. I haven't studied dinosaur bones. I haven't studied the geological record. Paleontology. There you go. But the other thing is that this principle of death being happening from transgression, that's the beginning of the world as it pertains to death. And so if the creation narrative has any bearing, whatever it is, whatever the mythological truth is behind that story, there's an epoch where everything is new, where death isn't a part, and then death becomes. What happened is that the billions of years, I don't know, there are people that talk about, in Christian circles, there's a few different versions that people hold of trying to imply truth in the creation narrative and modify it in different parameters. So, for instance, there are the most literal, which are like the young earth creationists, people who believe that the earth is very young and that there's a complete distinction of species. There are people who are old Earth, but believe in a distinct creation. So there are eons from before the creation narrative where the Earth is evolving, and perhaps for some people the animals are evolving, and man becomes a special creation at a certain point in time, and then human history begins. And then there are people who just see like a theistic origin to evolutionary premise. All of those are within Christian thought. Different people hold all those views. I'm prone personally to the more literal views, not even based on the text, based on the philosophical problem of death. That if you have death before the fall, then the creation isn't what the Bible makes it out to be. So whatever death comes happens after the fall and after man exists. But that's a biblically oriented worldview. It's probably not very satisfying to you.
Well, no, I mean, what I find, so why I'm a scientist rather than a religious person really is that, all of my views are basically evidence-based, right? I've seen this thing, and so therefore I believe it. And the cool thing about science is that it encourages doubt.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, here's the theory, tear it apart, man. Let's keep going until you prove me wrong, right? Until you prove the theory wrong. And what I like about science is that because there can be no proving that God doesn't exist, that the two are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
One day science may find out that there's a God,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. And I just like that idea that the science is kind of always open. But I think getting back to the abortion thing, the science and philosophy are two different disciplines. I mean, scientifically you could say that there's, I can't remember from my biology class, there were like 7 things to say that something's alive. It has to grow, it has to reproduce, it has to metabolize, it has to eat and whatever. And so the scientists could then apply just those things to a fetus. Okay, what doesn't the fetus do that all these that obeys these rules?
Mm-hmm.
But and you're going to keep going back until there is something that doesn't jive with what scientifically the scientific definition of life. So the philosophy is what is life and where does it begin? And I think that's the problem. I mean, when I think of what is life, I think of cows and cats and humans as being very similar. And when I was a child, I had a real hard time with it. I had a hard time accepting that things have to die in order for me to live. And that's the truth. If I want to continue living the next minute, things have to die for that to happen. Had a tough time with it, and I finally sort of come to terms with that. And I feel, vegetarians say, oh, it's, we're not going to kill animals, it's okay to kill plants. My feeling towards that is, well, you don't understand how a plant works, right? You don't look at a tree and see the big eyes and see the lungs and go, oh, okay, I understand that, so therefore, I can relate. You can relate to a cow, so therefore I'm not going to kill it because it makes me feel bad, because I would feel bad if somebody killed me. Because you don't understand a tree doesn't make it not alive, And so if it's okay to kill a tree and it's not okay to kill, wherever you draw that line is arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary to say, oh, I believe that above this is okay to kill and below this it's not okay to kill, or for me, this is what a human needs this in order to be considered alive. A chimpanzee, until we learn that it doesn't dream, or there's something about a chimpanzee that we're going to be able to pinpoint and say, okay, here's the difference between a chimpanzee and a human being, because we keep having to move that, right? We're like, oh, they don't have language. Turns out they do. Oh, they don't make tools. It turns out they do. Oh, we're constantly having to change our idea of what is the difference between animals and man, right? And my contention is that man is an animal. And therefore, for me to say that it's okay for things to die, that means all things. It means I am absolutely for euthanasia. If you feel like you don't want to live and you're miserable and you are in pain and you don't want to live anymore, that's on you. It's totally up to you, and I applaud it. I don't know. I hate to say pro-suicide, but that's how I feel. I don't have a problem. I have a problem. The only reason I have a problem with capital punishment is because I don't like the idea of my taking your life, right? Of my saying, I'm going to kill you. Like, if the government says it's not okay to kill people, and then in order to prove that they kill people, it's just this weird conundrum. It's either it's going to be okay to kill people or it's not going to be okay to kill people. And the thing about abortion is, where is it that we're people? And maybe you could say the same thing about serial killers.
Yeah.
They don't feel empathy. So maybe is that part of being a person?
Well, it's interesting to push the line towards how early does life begin, but I think we can push back the other way as well and say, like, there's procedures. I don't know if you've ever looked into it. It's horrifying what they do in abortions. Like, at the extreme end, partial birth abortion, where they birth half of a baby and then impale it in the base of its skull. It would be perfectly viable outside of the womb. And it's literally just infanticide. They're just killing a baby. Mm-hmm. And, like, so is that okay? Where's the line the other way? Like, how far can life advance? Could we at least say, if you're going to be causing pain? I listened to a lecture of a guy talking about the Roe versus Wade case. Interesting things about, that McCormick girl, I think that was her name, the girl that was Roe. She actually had her baby, and she actually she worked in an abortion clinic for quite a while, and then quit and became a part of the pro-life movement. So it's kind of a fascinating reversal there. But we're one of the few developed countries that has abortions after 14 weeks, at least according to this lecture. There were 4 countries. It was China, North Korea, Canada, and the U.S. And that's, like, if there's going to be abortion, which I'm opposed to, could we at least be at the place where, right, if you're causing pain to another organism, another human, that with a developed neural system, that's horrifying? Right. I mean, the answer for me is yes. That's the discussion that we have is, let's, how far along until we, that's what I'm talking about for as far as like what's life. For me, partial birth is a creature that is alive. So, right, I don't like the idea of you having a child in a toilet and strangling it. I mean, no, I don't like the idea. Should a 14-year-old girl that does that be put the rest of her life in prison for murder? No. Oh, that's a whole different question. We'll get there. But so, it's not something that we're going to solve because of the fact that you have to make a decision. Where does life... what is life? Where does it begin? And then, how important is the convenience of the person who is having this child? And when I say convenience, I mean it in the most extreme sense. I mean, it could be a life of misery. It could be a life of multiple miseries, and it could be a great thing. You've heard lots of people that have had abortions and then just gone, man, I wish I knew what that creature looked like. But what you don't hear is, on the other hand, there's lots of people that have babies that go, man, if I could go back in time and not have this child, I would. Yeah. I think what emerges between our worldviews is what kind of value to ascribe to life. So, from my perspective, whether you're talking about the front or the back end of life, you know, if you're talking about abortion, if you're talking about suicide, if you're talking about euthanasia, I'm always imploring life, life, life. Let's keep life alive, because, and I'm just trying to diagnose my own biases here, because I see life as some kind of divine spark, some kind of attribute from the Creator. And
I see it as a electric wiggling of cells. You know what I mean? It's like I don't believe in a spirit and a soul, and you know, I don't think we should torture monkeys.
Well,
However, however, you know, my wife's father had open heart surgery and lived another 30 years because of the techniques that were
developed
with animal testing. And in fact, my brother is a research scientist working right now with animals. You know, he's working on curing diseases that we want cured. So, you know, it's like, yeah.
So what's the closest to common ground that we can find, given our differences of worldview and our differences of evaluation of what we call life?
Well, I mean, I think that we both agree we don't want humans to suffer and be in pain. And, you know, I think that I could certainly buy into this many weeks of gestation we're going to call life. So, you know, I think the common ground is going to be, you know, how much time has elapsed. I mean, yours is zero.
So then, and so that's kind of like looking from a judicial legislative position, but maybe from a practical perspective for people like me and people like you, the common ground to address what is objectionable to everybody would be better recourse for people that are pushed into uncomfortable situations. How do we
Absolutely.
How do we help women not feel?
Absolutely.
So let me talk about what Chloe's doing. Chloe's leaving on the 13th. My second daughter, she's leaving for Africa, and the dynamics of the situation in Uganda, in Kampala, where our sister community is. That's both. There's a few Americans there, but it's African. The dynamics there is that I feel like Western good intentions in part and imperialism in part have pushed a narrative among the Africans, especially the East Africans and the post-colonial East Africans, that education is the answer to all their problems. Like, if you just get a degree, everything will be fine. Consequently, you have hundreds or thousands of young people in Kampala with college educations and no jobs, because it turns out it's not just an education, there also has to be an economy that can facilitate those people. So it's still very much the idea, especially people from villages, that they'll pin the whole family's resources, resource allocation, and hopes on sending usually the oldest child, whether it's a boy or girl, to college. And the hope is, if that child gets a degree, it will pull the whole family out of poverty. They'll get a good job, and then they'll have a stable place, and then they can help the rest of the family, or help put their brothers and sisters through school, or whatever. And that happens some. But what happens then is, if you have a girl who goes to school and she becomes pregnant, all the pressure, all the social pressure of her family and her society is pushing her. Now, in Uganda, abortion is technically illegal. It's very common, but it's also illegal. There are clinics you can go to. There's clinics on campus that you can go to for an abortion. It happens all the time, but it's technically illegal. So a lot of young women feel in this pressure from family and society and peers to have abortions, irrespective of whether or not they want the baby. So it's really other people in many cases pushing them towards this decision.
Right.
And so we have an organization that does education about abortion. We interview students and ask them how they feel about abortion issues, and then talk to them about abortion procedures and ask if that changes their mind, and often it does. Because when we see how horrifying some of these practices are, people are like, oh, I don't want that.
Right.
And then we also find through clinics and through other mechanisms young women who are in this place who would like to have their babies and feel like they can't. And we work on reconciliation with their family, reconciliation with the father of the baby, trying to find other alternatives for these women to bear their children, future employment and long-term stable housing. We do all these things because I don't feel like just passing laws actually answers any of the problems that we're dealing with in these discussions.
No, I agree, but you brought up something that well, maybe we have in a whole nother episode where we talk about this some more, because there's a lot here. But about women, I feel like young couple have sex and there's the prophylactic, the breaks, something happens, the woman's pregnant, the man can just walk away.
Mm-hmm.
He can continue his life. He was going to college, he was doing his thing, whatever, he's fine. The woman now, her life is completely going in a completely different direction. I mean, she was going to college and doing the same thing. They wanted to do the same thing. They both wanted to, whatever. Mm-hmm. And now she has no choice. Her life is derailed. And the guy can just walk away. So when we start talking about feminism and sort of equality for women, that's another thing to think about is, isn't that supremely unfair that it's all on the woman?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it is. And it's also supremely unavoidable. Like, even if she has an abortion, it's still on her.
Right.
It's still on her emotionally, physically.
It's right.
It's just
right. But
is.
She could go on with her life and continue going to school and continue the track that she had pictured for herself. Not to say that derailments aren't wonderful things every now, I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying it's just another thing to think about is the fact that this is only a women's decision that women have to make, and that kind of sucks.
And there's also other issues in regards to women about sex-selective abortions, that women are being, like in certain parts of the world, the most dangerous words are, it's a girl, because sex-selective abortions are still a very common thing in large parts of the world, and that adds its own layer of moral complexity. All
right, well, we need to wrap it up, but I think we talk about this some more, man, because there's some good stuff here.
Yeah.
So I love you.
Love you too. Thanks.
Sure. All right, so it's been a week since our very first episode. We talked about abortion. And you know how you have those conversations where after the conversation you're like, oh man, I wish I had said this.
In the shower, you're like, I wish I would have.
Yeah. So
next time I'm going to say this.
Yeah. So, I had a couple showers between last time and now.
At least one.
Smell nice. And so I wrote down actually just some thoughts that I had for you and a couple things I wanted to clarify about my own position.
Can I start?
Sure.
I only had one thought, and it wasn't so much about the issue because I didn't run into any major unexpected detours in our conversation. But the thing that I thought about after we sat down and recorded is I feel like I sounded kind of dumb, especially about like the evolution piece. I don't know if we kept that in or not, but
well, yeah, we did. But you were very clear that
it's
not something that you haven't studied.
Yeah, but the point about that's really fascinating to me is that there's all kinds of things like that we feign a position on when we don't really know.
Right.
Like, I was watching, I don't know if you watch Rebel Media ever, they have a lot of really good stuff. There's a guy that talks about sense making and how we often, like, we defer our position to someone that we trust as an authority. And that's just a part of life. It's what we do. I just don't have a good authority in that avenue.
To be honest, I was a little surprised about that because usually you are very, very, you've thought of pretty much everything. I mean, I come up with a question and you've really given it a lot of thought. the anti-vaxxer thing, I'm just, I think to myself, oh my, what kind of a person, what an idiot, who would not do that? And then I ask you why you don't. We'll talk about it in the future episode. And your answer's thoughtful and provoking and reasonable, and so you really do seem to have thought of it. So I was kind of just surprised that the answer was I haven't really thought about it, but well.
So there's categories. Like I feel the same way about a slew of issues, that I know what the standard positions are and where those positions come from, but I don't have a vested
and you don't want to say that without your own digging. So
that's the one thought I had.
Cool.
What were yours?
So I just really some clarification thing, and some of them I feel like I already know what you're going to say, but when we talked about abortion as being murder, like you were pretty clear that it is straight up killing children.
Yeah.
And when in thinking that, I thought about when you abort a baby at 5 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever, we talked about sort of the development process, but let's say it's on the low side.
Yeah.
And, or even more provocative, I suppose. Let's say that we do an in vitro fertilization and then you throw away 26 eggs. Okay, so those are 26 fertilized eggs that are now gone. And for you to, if you think of that as murder, in your mind, is there a difference between what just happened there and, say, like the Sandy Hook massacre where somebody came in and shot a bunch of school kids?
So are those 20-some children equivalent to 20-some fetuses in an in vitro clinic?
Yeah, I mean, and then my second part to that question is, is the doctor the murderer? I mean, the person that disposes of, and they don't always get thrown away. They give to research scientists or whatever.
Frozen,
they get
whatever.
used. Yeah, but is the doctor in the same level as that mentally ill child who shot up everybody? So tell me what you think about that.
Well, I think that thought experiments like that are useful to a certain degree. So let's create another one. Let's say, for instance, you're in an in vitro clinic and there's a fire, and you can save a 3-year-old who happens to be in the room, or a vial of 100 fetuses. Is the 3-year-old more important than the vial of 100 fetuses? And that thought experiment is interesting because what they do is they test the limits of our rationale. I think that it's the problem with those thought experiments is that they tend towards a false dilemma. And the false dilemma would be, if you choose the 3-year-old over the 100 vial, the vial of 100 fetuses, that somehow implies that you can't distinguish that the fetuses could be life. They could be life in a lesser sense. They're a life without attachment to parents and memories and the pain of burning through a fire and all of those things. So the quality, and another version of a thought experiment would be, you're in a hospital and there's a fire, and you can save a person who's an invalid or a person with 19 children waiting outside for them. What do you do? Well, that's a horrible decision to make, but we can. It's the boat experiment. 3 people get on the boat. Who gets to go? Like that. Measuring the value of life is a different proposition than what is life. And I feel like the question about this particular issue is, where does life begin, and why should that matter?
But my question to you is, if life begins at conception, which is your position, then is life is life? So is that 3-year-old and that fetus, the conceived fetus, exactly the same? Or do you also take into account... Because that's what I do. I mean, to me, I don't really feel like there's life until you're, born. Maybe even until you're self-aware, which doesn't happen until you're a few years old. I mean, it's sort of hard to say. To me, I think... and it's funny, I said this, and my wife Sarah said, "Don't say that." If an infant is killed and a 9-year-old is killed, I feel worse about the 9-year-old. The 9-year-old has some life experience and has attachments and has a personality that we've grown to love, and it's become something more. an infant, a baby becomes an infant and starts to talk, and then it starts to become self-aware, and then it gets a personality, and then it gets its first opinion on its own, and it gets more and more valuable to me as it goes along.
Well, I think the proposition of value is the problem. I think 9 years of experience is more to lose than 9 months, but I don't think that should be a value proposition. And I think that gets back to the broader issue. If it's an individual's life in the womb before it's born, to value that life, to make decisions that say this life is not worth whatever protection, human dignity, whatever the case may be, but this life is, that's where as humans we make really, really bad choices.
Right.
And so for me, my premise is based on, if it's life, then it's worth protecting. And that doesn't have to mean that it's the same kind of life, or the same quality of life, or the same connection of life.
So to be clear, you're going to say the 3-year-old and not the vial. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then an interesting sort of side note is that these thought experiments are very valuable, and they become real. For instance, we're talking about automated cars, right? Mm-hmm. Cars that are driving around on their own. And these cars are going to be able to make calculations, in a split second. And one time, one day, this car is going to be veering out of control, and there's going to be a 10-year-old child and an 80-year-old woman, and the car is going to make a decision. Do I hit the child? Do I hit the woman?
Or a group of children, or ditch the car and kill the driver.
Right, and then you get into are the rich people going to be able to override the system? Hey, make sure it favors the driver, So we're getting, but anyway, these thought experiments are, somebody's going to have to program that car.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe it's going to be so fast that they'll be able to see if this person has a criminal record, or this person's a child pedophile. I mean, who knows?
That's a brave new world.
But you're good. We're going to have to start making these decisions, and the decision is going to be right. We're going to take care of the 3-year-old, and we're going to let the 1-month-old die because the 3-year-old has formed more of an attachment.
That makes me uncomfortable.
It makes everybody uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It should make you uncomfortable. I mean, that's and I wanted to clarify too. We talked a lot about when life starts and everything, and about fetuses, and I wanted to say, if a fetus isn't life, like if it isn't an individual creature, so in other words, to destroy a fetus in the mother, if I don't think it's murder, what do I think that is? And to me, I feel like the fetus is a part of the mother until it is separated from the mother, which is a little weird with the partial birth abortion thing, because that's horrific and horrible to think about. But I just feel like it's a part of the mother, and we don't have any sort of right to say what that mother does with her own body, right? You can't force somebody to remove a cancer, or tell them they can't pierce their nose, or you cut their ears to look like Spock. I mean, whatever. It's like, even if it's destroying part of their body, it's not up to you to say that. So I feel like, me personally, that it's a part of the woman, and that the woman should be able to decide about her own body, and that it is not an individual creature until it is separated from.
I feel like that's a necessary conclusion for your position. It has to be that way. And that so what that means is that that's either that's the fulcrum of the argument. So that's either the vulnerability of your position or the strength of it. Because if it's not, like, if we make, by way of analogy, removing a tumor or cutting off an amputation, or whatever the case may be, or piercing your ear, or whatever, if it is her body, then then it's under her autonomy. But if it's not, if it's a discrete individual, neurologically, spiritually, metaphysically, and that doesn't apply to you, but if in some sense it's not, then all of that argument goes away.
Right.
And I feel like the weakest part of that position is to make the delineation what Roe versus Wade made the delineation in viability. Like, if it could survive outside of the womb, because there's so many problems with that argument. Like, is a person in a coma not a person? Is a person on a breathing machine not a person? Is a person that needs feeding tube not a person? Is a person that needs dialysis not a person?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. What about somebody who is on a feeding tube and his lungs are being kept alive by a machine, but they're essentially brain dead? I mean, they're alive and that everything's moving. Are you opposed to turning off the machine?
Not necessarily. I think that artificial life at a certain point has more risks and problems, and like if there's the way that I understand that those medical decisions have been made in the past is if there's no whatever they consider conscious brain activity, then it's an open discussion of whether or not you sustain life mechanically. But to put people in a place where they for whatever indeterminate amount of time they're just a shell, I don't know that qualifies for life. I think that those are horrible decisions that should be made by the people who love them.
Yeah, I mean, that's my personal nightmare.
Yeah.
My nightmare is that I am
a vegetable,
just being kept alive for the sake of being alive. You know, I just, to me, quality of life is life. Yeah. I mean, if I can't take part in my life, I mean, even if it's just my brain and I can blink and play chess with you, that's something. That, that's, to me, that's okay. But if I can blink and tell you I want to die, I'm not okay with this, then
But if there's not even that, then why would you care?
Well, right, except that because I don't know what happens when we die, and I don't know what goes on. I don't want to be in a state of torture.
Yeah.
I don't want to be in a state of constant agonizing pain.
Yeah.
I have this sort of nightmare that I've.
You're like paralyzed?
Then I'm completely paralyzed, and I can't tell people what's wrong. I can't say, and people are making decisions about me and for me, and it's this really horrible feeling.
So where I've touched on this issue the closest is we've had several premature babies, and with our premature babies, we've had problems with prematurity even before the children are born. So excuse me. Some of our children, we've started having trouble at 19, 20 weeks, which is it's not even the threshold of viability. And so we've walked with other families of preemie children who have had 20-something weekers, and they're born into a life of surgery and pain and misery, and some of them die. And that when you evaluate that as a parent, what would you want? And it's a new question to ask in our era. Like the question of sustaining people with breathing machines and feeding tubes is a relatively new phenomenon. And the idea of trying to decide what to do with a 26-week-old baby, do you do invasive procedures and surgery after surgery, and it doesn't have human touch, and it's just in an isolate?
At what cost life,
That's right.
Is it... life is precious and life is a breath of God, but is being tortured every minute of your life, is that something? I mean, I can't imagine that's what God would want.
Yeah, it's something that we have to consider now, I think, in a way that nobody ever did before. I heard there was a podcast I listened to, they asked people about end-of-life care. They asked people on the street, and they asked doctors at a medical conference. And all the people said, keep me alive as long as I'm not in pain. And all the doctors, I'm overstating, but this was the point. All the doctors said, let me go. As long as, just give me pain pills and give me pain control and let me die. Because the people in the medical field know these people being kept alive for years or months or weeks at a time, and for no avail except for people's emotions and their family. It's a bad way to go.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear you say that, since a lot of these people make these decisions based on their religion, based on, well, see,
I don't feel like if there's I don't feel like artificial sustaining is a moral necessity.
Yeah.
I'm glad that it's available for some people when it's an appropriate decision, but I don't feel like it's a moral necessity.
Yeah.
I'm kind of a naturalist in that regard.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad I live in the scientific era, but I very much appreciate creation and the created order, and the idea that we're living to 90, 100, 110 on machines and stuff doesn't sound like a good idea to me.
Do you have a DNR?
I don't, but I should.
Yeah. I was thinking about just getting a tattoo on me.
if you could find room, they would. You'd have to put it on your forehead.
No question here. I don't want there to be any sort of question. So another question I had for you is stem cell research. But I assume you're opposed to that since we're talking about.
I feel like it's another issue that I don't know much about. The one thing that I had heard is that they have learned how to mutate cells into stem cells without having to develop them out of fetal tissue. Right. I don't know how true that is or what it affects.
Yeah, and I don't know if the genesis was fetal tissue and they've become now, so that doesn't still count.
I don't know either.
But let's say that we're talking about fetal tissue, and you have one of your 11 beautiful children has some sort of a heart condition and is going to die, and somebody says, hey, we can grow a heart out of, using his cells and stem cells, and his body won't reject it, we can just replace his heart and it'll be his heart. What do you think? I mean, if somebody else, if a fetus had to die, I think maybe we're talking about the same question about the 3-year-old. Maybe you can save your son because your son is.
And I don't know how far you get away. That's one of the moral arguments about vaccines is that several of them are developed from aborted fetal lines, and I reject those out of hand, regardless of their efficacy over that issue. How far away do you get from that it doesn't matter? I don't know. I think it's an open moral concern, and
we're going to talk about vaccines because I do have
as a whole separate issue.
Yeah, because I do have very specific questions about that.
So maybe we'll kick that can down the road a little bit.
I have a friend who became pregnant and. Late into a pregnancy, she learned that this child has a horrible disorder that the doctor basically said, this child will die. There's no question that this child will live. It will die, and it will die within days of being born, and it will be extraordinarily painful and difficult, and it will live a very, very short life of absolute torture and misery. So she decided to abort this child. And actually had to go to some other, like Kentucky or something, I don't remember, but some state that allowed late term, the term where she was, or that late term abortion, so that she could do this. To me, I feel like that was the right decision to make, simply because, quality of life versus just plain life. I guess the question for you is abortion ever okay? Is there, like in that situation?
Well, and maybe the other species of that argument would be health of the mother.
Yes, if a mother is, if it comes down to we either abort the baby and the mother, we abort the baby and the mother lives, or the baby's born and the mother dies. If the mother has 6 children, do you abort the baby so that the mother can take care of these children, or not? Yeah. Do we leave?
I think those questions are more like the 3-year-old or the vial of fetuses. Okay. I think that we can evaluate life and the potential of life and not negate life.
I like to hear that. I feel like that's reasonable. I feel like a lot of pro-life is just like no abortion, no matter what, period. If you're raped, if you're...
I feel like there's horrible propaganda on both sides of this issue.
Yeah.
I listen to some pro-life stuff and I'm like, what? You people are crazy.
Yeah.
And I listen to some pro-abortion stuff, pro-choice stuff, and I'm like, you people are crazy.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Like, it drives me nuts. I feel like some more ration and reason and sympathy in the discourse is certainly warranted. But let me say this also. Those kinds of cases are such an astronomical rarity.
For sure.
That if we kept them in that category, I'd be much happier. If we weren't making public policy for hundreds of thousands of abortions based on that kind of very, very specific case that's very, very rare, I think that makes more sense. I can tell you... Like, if I was your friend, I wouldn't abort. And I know that that's a difficult decision. I've had many children and we've had many problems. And I trust in... how do I say it? How would I articulate it? don't feel like I have the moral calculus, the ability to make that decision and choose to end the life of my child.
Is that because, despite what the doctor says, you don't know that child will suffer?
That's a part of it, and I don't know that for I don't know what it would mean. Like, I'd have to know the specifics of what that case looked like, but I can imagine a scenario where my wife had a child that we knew wouldn't live, and holding it and being there with it until it dies. That's better for mother, for father, and for baby than for a doctor to stab it in the base of its skull late in life.
I am a photographer, and I actually worked for a company called Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep. And we took photographs of the mother and a child when the child was going to be stillborn, or we knew that the child wasn't going to live more than a few hours. In a few cases, the child would be born, and then I would leave the room, and when the child died, I would come in and take pictures with the mother.
It's such a sweet thing to do.
It is a wonderful thing, and people think it's macabre, but I mean,
I think it's beautiful.
You have this child. I mean, you carry this thing for 9 months, and you have a record. This is the record of So and so
Isn't that a testimony of the life, though, that people care so much that they want that?
Yeah, I agree. But there are some people that don't want that, and that's sort of what we're talking about. But that's different than knowing that there will be pain. Knowing that there will be absolute pain. I mean, if you were to ask me, would I rather have a screwdriver shoved in my skull and die in 5 seconds, or would I rather have 3 days of torture?
So let me ask this way: if you knew that one of your children at the age of 23 was going to have some horrible terminal disease and be miserable for 3 months and then die, would you still value their life? Would you still have wanted them to live?
They're 23 years old?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if the doctor said, "Oh, your child's going to live for 3 months and then have 3 days of torture and die," I mean, now we're talking about
It's a different.
I mean, that's a crystal ball situation, but again, that's a value. 23 years is a relationship that I will forever be able to remember and talk about and think about, and I would imagine, oh, this is what my child would say and what would do because I know this person. A fetus is just, I mean, everybody's like, oh, look at my baby, isn't it cute? Well, it's a little wrinkled peanut. They all, yeah, sure, it's cute. I mean, they're all kind of that way. And it has no personality. It's devoid of anything until it gets a little bit of, living happening. Anyway, the last thing that I want to say, me personally, is being pro-life does not mean that I am being pro-choice doesn't necessarily mean...
it wasn't that easy.
We talked about how I don't care about life. I'm anti-life. Being pro-choice does not mean I'm pro-abortion. I don't enjoy the prospect of that. I don't like the idea. For me, I would prefer that people not get abortions. I would prefer that people not get pregnant in the first place, right? If we could do anything we can do so that you don't have to make that horrible decision. Either way, it doesn't matter what happens, your life is altered. Yeah. You have a baby, your life is altered. You have an abortion, your life is altered. I mean, there's nothing. So, I'm not for you just have sex and then if you get pregnant, you can have an abortion. That's not how I feel at all. So I just want to be clear.
Very few people do. I think the crazy pro-choice faction maybe, but I think that what you said is what most people that are on the pro-choice side of the argument would say. I would say in response to that, though, that's exactly my point. The fact the fact that it's not a medical procedure, the fact that it's not like getting an ingrown toenail removed, the fact that it's not like getting your ear pierced, that it's not just like a menses where you're sloughing off the inside of your uterus, the fact that it's not that is the indicator to me morally that there's more there than her body and her choice. The fact that it's a bad thing that you would have an abortion.
Right. I mean, I think it's a bad thing. Yeah, an early term abortion, super early, to me, it is like a sloughing off of a menstrual cycle. I mean, it's not much more than that in my mind, to me. But I appreciate that a woman will spend the rest of her life thinking, could have been a child, or I mean, or maybe she wouldn't. I don't know. I mean, it just depends on who you are.
Yeah.
I'm not a woman, and I don't understand that. I mean, we talked about this last week about how I just feel it's kind of unfair that sort of all this is on the mother. I mean, the mother's the one that has to make these decisions that are terrible, terrifying and difficult. So.
Well, it's a good wrap up. I'm glad we did that.
Yeah, awesome. So.